to flames. Freedom, freedom, I can't move. Freedom, cut me loose. Yeah. Freedom, freedom, where are you? 'Cause I need freedom too. I break chains up on myself. Won't let my freedom rot in hell. Hey, I'ma keep on running 'cause the winner.
Some people have an elephant to show. No one here has ever seen an elephant. They bring it at night to a dark room. One by one, we go in the dark and come out, saying how we experience the animal. One of us happens to touch the trunk, a water pipe kind of creature. Another, the ear, a very strong, always moving, back and forth fan animal. Another, the leg. I find it still, like a column on a temple. Another touches the curved back, a leathery throne. Another, the cleverest, feels the tusk, a rounded sword made of porcelain. He is proud of his description. Each of us touches one place and understands the whole that way. The palm and the fingers feeling in the dark are how the senses explore the reality of the elephant. If each of us held a candle there, and if we went in together, we could see it.
Conflict is often about the elephant in the room. And I couldn't think of a better way to start Love Letters to Conflict than with a poem about an elephant by one of the most legendary writers of love poems, Rumi. My name is Mathura Mahendren, and I want to welcome you to Love Letters to Conflict, Postcards from the Pursuit of Understanding. Just noticing that's not coming up on the slides, just checking in. While we're waiting for the slides, I am joined here on stage by Bina, who is grateful to you all for being here to see, to understand, and maybe even come to love the elephant in the room in its entirety. So you should know that sometimes Bina gets really excited, especially when she feels seen. And she might let out a trumpet like the one that you just heard. And the way to honor that... Shout out. And the way to honor that is whenever you hear it to say back, "We see you, Bina!" And at the... Yeah, you do. Okay, so we're going to practice. Maybe Bina want to give us like a trumpet? So we get to practice that, and as we go, feel free to kind of use your body. I know you've been sitting for a while, and if you want to be like, "We see you, Bina," and get up, like do the thing. The other being that is here with me today, and if we get the slides up, we will see, thank you, is my paternal grandfather, who I call Apapa, who passed away 4 years ago on this day. And he was and continues to be the spirit of the elephant in my life. And in acknowledging his presence today, I want to draw on and invite us to embody some of the qualities that both he and Bina share. And those are the ability to hold strength and power alongside gentleness, a deep respect for the matriarchy, the ability to hold and chew on tough things for longer than most in order to give them the best chance at digestion, the long incubation period, 22 months for elephants, and the understanding that good things take time, and that it takes time to build things that last. The ability to think and sense deeply with every part of their bodies, and the wisdom that is born of this depth. And last but not least, the impeccable ability to remember where we came from and to find our way back to ourselves and each other. So, Bina's here, Apapa's here. You don't have to interact with them, but they're around. So I just spoke about the body and sensing with all parts of our body, and I want to walk us through a somatic exercise. So you just have to use your hands. There's no interpretive dance yet. So just stretch out your fingers a little bit. We're going to do this in 2 parts, and then I'll kind of share a bit of why I asked you to do it. So it's called the fist, and so we're going to have one hand be a fist, and the role of this fist is to stay closed no matter what. And the role of this hand in this first part of the exercise is to try and open it by any means necessary. Don't hurt yourself, but give it a good go, you know? It helps to close your eyes and kind of tune into how does the fist feel in this interaction, how does the hand feel in this interaction, and how does that resonance reverberate through the rest of your body. You might want to try a few different configurations, but mostly just feel for the sensation. And once you have a sense, just stretching out your fingers again. And we're going to do that again, and this time the fist has the same role. The goal is to stay closed, but the goal of this hand is just to hold it. And you're closing your eyes if you feel comfortable, and just paying attention to, again, what does the fist feel like, what does the hand feel like, and how does that move through the rest of your body. Don't forget to breathe. Sometimes we forget that when we're focused. And once you have a sense, just stretching out your fingers. So I've shared this exercise in many contexts, and there's no right or wrong way to do it. What I do want us to remember, though, is the difference between the felt sense of being acted upon versus the felt sense of being noticed. Particularly when something is not yet ready or wanting to be acted on. And often when we think about conflict, we jump into the solving and the fixing and the intervening before we've fully seen and understood it for what it is. And when we do that, when we bypass that step of understanding, we prioritize getting to the end of the conflict rather than getting to the bottom of it. And I think there's something about being seen as we are, nothing more, nothing less, that can actually free us to embody our truest potential, our truest version of ourselves, and access our full potential. Oftentimes, with that second exercise where you're just holding it, people notice that the fist on its own starts to loosen. And it's not because anything is trying to open it, but because the fist is no longer resisting that external pressure. It feels safe enough to reveal itself. And I think the same goes for conflict. Conflict can be transformative, but not before we are willing and able to see it for what it is. So most of my theses, you're walking into a thesis defense is what's happening here. Transparency, you know. Most of my theses begin with this belief that to be loved is to be understood, and to love is to understand. And the more time that I've spent in, around, and with conflict, both as a conflict mediator and someone who also finds myself in conflict, what I've understood is that conflict is deeply misunderstood, and that is by design. One of the ways that I've learned to love and understand people and things is through understanding their lineage, or who, what, where they come from. It's going back to their roots and understanding the soil that cultivated this person or this thing, for better or for worse. It's kind of like the equivalent of meeting your parents' friends and being like, oh, yeah, this makes sense. So in terms of conflict, as much as in this moment, within the systems that we live in, we see conflict as adversarial, as something to be avoided, as something that is bad, conflict at its root means to strike together. Con means together, and flegere, which is a verb, means to strike. So that feels important to name. Conflict is inherently about relationship and moving in relationship. That said, part of understanding lineage is also to understand it within our current context. We don't see conflict as adversarial for no reason. We see it that way because that's how we're socialized within the systems that we live in. And when I say systems that we live in, I mean systems of supremacy, systems of domination, patriarchy, colonialism, white supremacy, capitalism. Even if you look at that phrase, to strike together, each of these systems that I just named would be threatened by the idea of people striking together. So it's in their best interests to pathologize conflict and to make it undesirable. Anti-capitalist, that one. So conflict, by definition, I shared the etymology, but the definition of conflict is disagreement, difference, or argument between two or more parties. And to understand conflict, we have to understand how we are taught to perceive difference and disagreement. And the thing with systems of supremacy is that they are riddled with contradictions. And the way that they survive these contradictions is by having us fight within ourselves and with each other rather than fight against the system. They tell us to strike each other rather than strike together. And what supremacy does, it heightens difference when it's convenient and then erases difference when it isn't. So for example, supremacy needs difference because the only way that a group of people can reign over another group of people is to believe that they're better than. And in order to believe that they're better than, there needs to be some sort of difference that they can exploit to say that this permutation, my permutation of race, gender, class, etc., is higher, is superior to yours. That said, at the same time, supremacy also collapses and erases difference when the people's understanding of difference becomes a threat to the system. So for example, when people start to develop a class analysis, this understanding that 1% of the population hoards 99% of the world's wealth and resources, supremacy then tells the story that we are all capable of becoming the 1%, that there is a path that we can all follow to get there, capitalism, because we're all the same. The propaganda of multiculturalism is a way of saying that no matter where we come from or what color we are all the same. We will all be treated the same, and we will all be given the same opportunities so long as we are striving for whiteness, so long as we are in service to capitalism, so long as we continue to deny that we are settlers on this land. And I think that's why conflict at its root is so scary to supremacy. Because when we really engage with conflict, when we get to the bottom of it rather than the end of it, we realize that we are different, but we are not supreme. We are not inferior or superior to each other. We are different. And that realization breaks the entire premise that supremacy is built on. So supremacy keeps us in conflict with ourselves and each other by pathologizing difference so that we aren't in conflict with the system. At the same time, it feeds a culture of conflict avoidance because if we actually got to the root of the conflicts within and between us, we would realize that the intervention is to strike together against the system. We'll get to the harmony, We'll get there. So just to catch us up, I know I've been saying a lot of capitalism like 5 times already. Conflict at its root is to strike together. And systems of supremacy are invested in us not getting to the root of conflict so that we don't strike together. So it's clear that even though conflict at its root can be life-affirming, it is and has been prone to a lot of manipulation, both by the systems of supremacy, but also the way that those systems work through us. So how do we know? How do we know when and how to engage in conflicts in ways that don't ultimately reinforce the systems that we're trying to dismantle? Something that I found really helpful in discerning this is this idea that the opposite of conflict avoidance is not conflict. It's generative conflict. And generative conflict, as defined by the Wildfire Project, is conflict that generates more possibilities, greater connection, and fuller expression, rather than shutting these things down. So this includes moving away from conflict avoidance, but also on the other extreme, moving away from an unhealthy attachment to conflict. So it can be helpful when we're met with the question of, should I or shouldn't I, should we or shouldn't we engage in this conflict process, to ask, do I believe that this process will actually generate more possibilities, greater connection, or fuller expression? And, let's say, as with all good things under these systems, even the language of generative conflict can be co-opted. One example of this is what writer Alex Verman Green calls the having conversations industrial complex. Which demands, quote unquote, having conversations as a never-ending precondition to any meaningful change. In this complex, people who are considered, quote unquote, professional, so diversity consultants, speakers, advisory boards, panelists, politicians, etc., are paid to generate a quote unquote conversation that doesn't need to show tangible results. Yeah, I know. I feel you. Instead, the only role of these conversations is to generate more conversations. And while they profit off of the complex, professionally, socially, financially, ideologically, these are the people who become thought leaders, quote unquote, for anyone who's not in the room. While they're profiting off of this complex, the people on the front lines of these issues are being injured, arrested, deported, labeled terrorists. And so the goal of this complex is to enrich the powerful and to diffuse radical demands. And I share this because this idea of quote-unquote dialogue is really attractive. And it can sound generative, and it can even look generative. But it's important to ensure that it's not like this brand of dialogue, which is actually designed to stifle expression and to limit possibilities for those who are most impacted by the topics of these conversations. And one of the ways to actually check whether something is generative or not is not just asking this question in our minds, but to ask it of our bodies. Does this actually feel like it's generating more possibilities in my body? Because we feel possibility in our bodies before we see them in the world, before we experience them in the world. Our body is also where we experience connection. And it is through our bodies that expression happens. So in this sense, our bodies are less prone to the manipulation of the systems of supremacy than our minds. And that is exactly why we're told not to listen to our bodies, why our bodies are so heavily policed. I got some people standing up. Love it. The other reality is that sometimes people and organizations just don't have the resources or sometimes even the desire to engage in generative conflict. And as a conflict mediator, I think it's really important for people and groups in conflict to understand the different approaches that they can take and choose a process that they all actually want to move through versus one person dragging people through a process. Conflict management, for example, involves containing and mitigating the negative effects of a conflict. It's damage control. Conflict resolution refers to the immediate and short-term problem solving that happens in order to resolve the specific issue that is presenting itself with a practical solution to meet the immediate demands of the parties involved. So if there is a disagreement, it involves coming to an agreement. If there needs to be someone who is right or wrong, it involves figuring out who is right or wrong. Conflict transformation is a longer-term approach that involves getting to the root of the conflict and shifting the conditions, whether that's structural, cultural, relational, personal, that cause the conflict, or shifting our understanding of those conditions. So conflict management prioritizes containing the conflict. Conflict resolution prioritizes getting to the end of the conflict, and conflict transformation prioritizes getting to the bottom of it. The first prioritizes the damage, the second prioritizes the problem, and the third prioritizes the relationship and the systems and culture within which that relationship exists. So there are times when people come out of conflict processes that are based in the first two approaches and still feel unsatisfied and unfulfilled, because while we've contained the damage and solved the problem, or the immediate issue at least, we haven't tended to or mended the relationship. And at the same time, sometimes you need to do the damage control and solve the immediate problem in order to free up the energy that is needed to do the transformative relational work. So it's important that it's important to consider that it's easy to idealize conflict transformation. It feels the most ideologically aligned with abolition, with being in right relationship, with transformative justice, but it also requires the greatest investment of time, of energy, and also of vulnerability. And it can be harmful to push conflict transformation on a group of people that aren't ready or wanting to do that. The other thing that perpetuates conflict avoidance within our culture is the belief that conflict avoidance is convenient. Something that really shifted my perspective on this is the idea that conflict avoidance is not inconvenient, it is dishonest. To quote author Adrienne Marie Brown, conflict means two people are able and willing to be honest about a difference. Instead of pretending that they both agree or being apathetic and saying it doesn't matter, they're saying this matters and we feel differently. And we feel differently. How do we figure out how we move through this together? And in the context of organizing and organizations, generative conflict and this honesty that is required for generative conflict can also sharpen our strategy. Oftentimes when we think of conflict, we think of working through feelings, and it's this binary that happens between we have to work on strategy and then we have to work on emotions. They're connected. So to paraphrase the words of organizer Yotam Maram, strategy is about making deliberate choices. It asks us to remain in tension for long enough to expose our deepest misalignments. It requires the skill to actually enter into serious disagreement, to sharpen a position through disagreement, to say no and to narrow our focus and emerge from it with a stronger, sharper position. And at its core, so much of good strategy is about telling the truth. It's about finding the truth. What is real about our opponent? What is real about us, about the world, about our role? What is the best way to move from here to there? And what will we need to change, even if it's painful, in order to get there? One example of someone who embodied this understanding of the link between generative conflict and strategy is Ghassan Kanafani. Kanafani was a Palestinian revolutionary, writer, and the spokesperson for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. During his lifetime, he served many roles, including as the editor of several publications. And in each publication that he edited, he introduced a section for public discussion. It was a space for Palestinians to contribute to a forum that was geared toward the question of how do we get free? And it wasn't just about being informed or even discussion for discussion's sake. It was focused and very much about the question of how do we best fight in order to get free? It was around a strategy. He even published perspectives that were opposing each other or perspectives that he didn't necessarily agree with because he felt that it was important for the people to know where the people stood, for it to be out in the open. He was committed to publishing what is a translation, but translates to the truth and nothing but the truth for the masses. And this kind of forum was particularly important during that time because the Zionist strategy in Palestine then and now is to fragment Palestinians across the West Bank, Gaza, the territories of 48, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and the wider diaspora, and to sow divisions between them. So Kanafani was like, it's okay if we have opposing perspectives, but it's going to be on our terms. We're going to figure out what we don't agree on, and it's going to be out in the public, and no one is going to tell us why we are fighting against each other. And this work was so powerful that it was one of the things that flagged Kanafani as a threat in the eyes of the Israeli occupier, who eventually targeted and assassinated him at the age of 36. What Kanafani understood is that if we as groups are conflict avoidant and can't tell ourselves the truth, we end up with a weak strategy that sends resources, including people, attention and efforts in different and even contradictory directions. We're wasting our time, we're wasting our people, we're wasting our resources. In some ways, it's the modern day equivalent of people coming together with the intention of co-creating, but at the first sign of difference or conflict, their way of dealing with the difference is not to acknowledge it or understand what it means or where it's coming from, but instead saying, okay, you do that over there, I'm going to do this over here, and at some point we'll figure out how it'll work together. And really that either means you don't work together or it ends up in greater conflict. So it's essentially co-working masquerading as co-creating. And that's fine if ultimately you're intending to build separate things. But it's not if we're trying to build power and if we're trying to grow movements. The kind of co-creating that generative conflict demands requires a baseline level of trust, both in ourselves and in the people with whom we're in conflict. And trust is a word that we throw around a lot, so I want to define it. According to somatics practitioner Stacey K. Haynes, trust is intention plus competence plus reliability, all held within an analysis of systemic power and conditions. So when I've had to decide whether or not to engage in conflict transformation with someone or with a group, I've asked myself, do I believe that this person actually wants to engage in this work? And usually we stop there. Do I believe that this person has the skills to be able to engage in this work? Has this person demonstrated repeatedly over time that they have this intention and they hold this competence? Sometimes we have the first two and we're like, well, I'm skilled and I want to, so especially if you've broken trust, that reliability piece, demonstrating that over time is really important. And then last but not least, what are the power dynamics at play, both interpersonally and structurally within this conflict, and how are they impacting how this conflict is playing out? And this trust is important because the process of conflict transformation invites us to be changed by the people with whom we are in conflict. And allowing ourselves to be changed in this way, especially by someone we disagree with, can be a really vulnerable thing. So we have to ask ourselves, do I trust this person enough to change me in ways that are ultimately aligned with the kind of person I want to be? This can be a tricky question to sit with, especially when the process of conflict transformation feels aligned, but you're not sure if this is the person or these are the people or this is the group that you want to do this work with. We can't do this work with everyone as much as we might want to because of how intensive it is. Maybe we will 10, 20, 15 years from now, but as we're learning this skill set, we do need to be discerning. And especially in the context of community, in the context of family, in the context of friendship or intimate partnership, it can be really hard to admit to yourself and to admit to people that you love and care about that you no longer trust them, which is another reason why we avoid having that conversation. And one thing that influences our ability to extend trust towards others, particularly those that we disagree with, is our ability to trust ourselves. We have more grace for others, more willingness to give people a second chance and be changed by them when we trust our ability to discern and advocate for what we need. On the flip side, when our self-trust has been compromised, it can feel scarier and more vulnerable to extend trust to others, especially when they disagree with us. One of the reasons that we avoid conflict is because we don't trust ourselves to uphold our own interests within a disagreement. We fear being manipulated. We fear betraying our own needs. This can be especially true for people who have people-pleasing tendencies. Because conflict pushes us to think about how we think, to interrogate why we believe what we believe, and we can't do that if we're worried that we'll be gaslit or taken advantage of when our guard is down. And this baseline level of trust in ourselves and in others lays the foundation for generative conflict because it allows us to show up from a place of agency rather than control. Control is connected to a particular outcome, whereas agency is connected to the energy that we put forth in order to effect change. Control seeks to direct change, whereas agency seeks to influence it, understanding that there will always be some things that are outside of our control. Control is often rooted in fear, whereas agency is rooted in trust. Trust in one's own capacity to effect change. Control is a tool of supremacy, and agency is a prerequisite to liberation. Generative conflict, so conflict that leads to more possibilities, deeper connection, and fuller expression, requires a divestment from control and an investment in agency. And in order to do that, we need to trust ourselves. A little louder, come on. So as I share all of this, I want to acknowledge that there is a tender underbelly to this topic and maybe even this whole event. And it's that it can be really, really, really painful to be in conflict within community. And I want to name some of the reasons why. At its root, community is formed by what unites us, what we have in common. Then conflict comes along and reveals the places where we disagree, where we are different. And that can feel threatening, especially because we often come into community with the assumption and the expectation that it will be a place of healing, or at the very least that it won't be traumatizing. We conveniently forget that everyone, including us, comes into these relationships and into these communities with trauma. And trauma happens when our core needs, our inherent needs for safety, belonging, and dignity are pit against each other. You can't have them all, you can only pick one or two. For example, situations when you have to give up your safety in order to belong, or when you have to give up your dignity in order to be safe. So we enter into community with this assumption and expectations that our needs for safety, belonging, and dignity will be met. And in doing so, we essentially put our communities, particularly communities that we chose, on pedestals. So when they fall, the fall is that much harder because we have elevated them to that level. And because communities are formed around what unites us, we often assume that we have more in common with fellow community members than we actually do. Or we do so without having that conversation. So for example, with the Palestine Solidarity encampment at U of T, hypothetically speaking, I'm not saying I was there. It's being recorded. There may or may not have been the assumption that because we're all here for this cause, which is considered fairly progressive, fairly radical, that we all share the same politic and that we all embody it in the same way. Because we're all here, we all believe in armed struggle, we all believe in abolition, we all believe in Black liberation, in Indigenous sovereignty, in queer and trans liberation, in solidarity with unhoused people, in anti-imperialism, and the list goes on. And when we find out that that's not the case, it can feel more like a betrayal or a heartbreak than when we experience difference anywhere else, even on the street, because we had assumed a level of sameness and a level of safety and solidarity in that sameness when that's not actually the case. In situations like this, what does it look like to break the association that safety is derived from sameness? What does it look like to build safety not necessarily based on sameness or agreement, but based on trust? Trust that is rooted in intention, competence, reliability, and an understanding of power dynamics. The other piece is that when we are a part of a community or a group and in deep relationship with people, we start to identify with them. We start to see them as extensions and reflections of ourselves. So when they embody something that we disagree with, it can be extremely activating because it feels personal. And we start to ask ourselves, well, what does that say about me if my parent or my sister or my friend or my partner did this or believes this, and I'm in relationship with them? And this dynamic shows up a lot in the context of family, whether that's chosen or blood, and in intimate relationships, because that's often where we experience identification the strongest. And again, this is by design. Systems of supremacy live for conflicts within community. They live because of conflicts in community. Because nothing is more demoralizing or destabilizing than the feeling of being betrayed by those we love, or the feeling of being at odds with people that we thought we were in community with. It's one thing to realize that your government or your MP or even your boss is Zionist, but it's another to realize that your parent, your friend, or the person that runs a soup kitchen that you volunteer with, very specific example, is a Zionist. And in the words of organizer Dylan Rodriguez, demoralization is one of the most powerful tactics of counterinsurgency. Beyond arrests and assassinations, demoralization is the most effective way to counter and quell revolution. Even better for the system if we take care of it ourselves. So knowing that, I know I keep taking this on that. Knowing that, I want to offer us a reframe. As much as conflict with people that we love or care about can feel more complex than conflict with strangers, I actually think that that love contributes to the transformative potential of those conflicts. When disagreement is attached to someone we love, when difference is attached to someone we love, we are more likely to pay attention. We're more likely to want to understand it. We stay with it longer rather than dismissing it as someone yelling on the street. We want them to know what we think, and we want to know what they think, even if we disagree. So in this sense, conflict is one of the ways in which love for ourselves, love for each other, love for the land, can push us to change. Conflict can push us to change who and what we love and or how we love them. So with that, I'm going to leave us with a quote from Dr. Sama Jabbar, who is a Palestinian psychiatrist based in Jerusalem, who is the former head of the mental health unit at the Ministry of Health in Palestine. And as I read this quote, there's going to be a lot of text on the screen, so feel free to close your eyes if you just prefer to listen. I want you to notice how easy it is to swap the word Palestine for the word life. How interchangeable these two words are in the context of what she's saying. A revolutionary movement that cannot tolerate internal difference is not revolutionary enough to liberate Palestine, to liberate life. A national struggle that demands obedience rather than engagement is not national, but sectarian. A decolonial project that replicates the surveillance, exclusion, and erasure of the colonial state has already lost its way. True liberation is the ability to think, speak, and act freely in the pursuit of justice. It is the capacity to hold contradictions without collapsing into division. It is the refusal to become what we resist. The road to freedom is not paved with denunciations, but with dialogue among the oppressed. It is not built by eliminating difference, but by understanding it as a source of strength. If we are to build a truly liberated Palestine, if we are to build a truly liberated life, we must first liberate ourselves from the colonizer's most insidious weapon, the impulse to turn against one another. So I'm going to leave us in the same way that we started, with words from a guy who wrote love poems. Out beyond the ideas of right doing and wrongdoing, there is a field, and I will meet you there. This is the field. There's a little memento for you at the door, so feel free to grab it on your way out or on your way to a break.
What we'll do actually is we did have planned a slight break in between this and the next session, but because we're running behind, we want to catch up to speed so we can honor the lunch period. So Lorraine's going to come up on stage now, but the memento that Temwa mentioned, Mathura mentioned, I'm going to pass on stage. I'm just going to pass through the audience, and then we'll grab it through the back. If you do need to take a break, if you do need to stretch and stand, please feel to do so. Please feel free to go to the bathroom as well. And if you're able to stay here, please join me in welcoming Lorraine to the stage.